Okay, so imagine this. You're back in 1830 getting ready for a big celebration and you're about to bake a cake. But we're not talking about a quick little afternoon project here.
Oh,
This is a
oh, oh.
2-day commitment.
2 days.
Yeah, just for the cake itself. Forget about any fancy frosting,
Wow.
right? The cake was the marathon back then. Are you ready to explore a time before boxed mixes and instant yeast?
I know I am. Me too.
Well, today we are going to dive deep into the history of cake, looking at how early American bakers really changed how we think about this sweet treat. We'll mainly be using the podcast episode called Old World Cake, New World Cake. It's from the series The History of American Food, and we'll be uncovering the challenges bakers faced back then, the surprising ingredients they used, and the amazing ingenuity that shaped American cakes as we know them today. So by the end of this deep dive, you will have a newfound appreciation for that cake mix just sitting in your pantry, and maybe even some fun historical facts to share at your next get-together.
That sounds like fun.
It does.
Yeah.
Let's travel back in time to the early 19th century and step into the world of early American baking.
Right.
What were some of the biggest hurdles that bakers had to face back then?
Well, think about ingredients we just take for granted today. Back
Oh,
then, they were a whole different ball game. Take butter, for instance. It was often super salty just to keep it from going bad. So can you imagine having to wash your butter before you could even start baking?
hmm.
And forget about those easy bags of fine white sugar.
Oh, yeah.
You would have to pound these lumps of sugar into powder at home.
Talk about a workout.
I know, right? A real arm workout, and
Yeah,
the rising process itself could really test your patience.
I bet. It must have been a waiting game.
It was yeast risen cakes. Those are the common ones. Back then, they could take an entire day, sometimes even two, to rise properly. Can you imagine all that anticipation and then the disappointment if your yeast decided not to cooperate?
I can only imagine.
Yeah.
And if you thought using eggs was a quicker option, think again. Hours and hours of whipping those eggs by hand. No electric mixers to save the day. That's some serious dedication.
It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? Makes you appreciate the ease of modern baking.
It really does. But with all these challenges, how did they even find the time to bake regularly? It seems like it would have taken up so much of their lives.
Well, that's where American ingenuity really comes in. Remember, this was a time of westward expansion. Everyone was on the move. They needed faster, more adaptable solutions, and that's where pear lash comes into play.
Pear lash. That sounds pretty intriguing.
Tell me more.
Well, pearl ash potassium carbonate is a chemical leavening agent that comes from wood ash. You could call it an early version of baking soda, and it completely revolutionized how Americans baked. It allowed for these lighter, fluffier cakes without those long rising times needed for yeast. It's actually really cool how they adopted this practice, likely learning it from indigenous peoples who already used wood ash in their cooking.
Hmm.
Like in nixtamalization, where you soak and cook corn in this alkaline solution, often using wood ash.
Oh, yeah. That's a fantastic example of how different cultures influenced American food. But pear lash sounds almost too good to be true. Were there any downsides? Well, it did have this slightly bitter, soapy taste, which meant it could only be used with cakes that had stronger flavors like gingerbread, which could mask that unusual taste.
So it was a step in the right direction, but not the perfect answer yet.
Yeah.
So while Americans were busy experimenting with this pear lash, what was happening across the pond in Europe?
Over in Europe, they were busy developing these elaborate yeast-risen cakes, often loaded with candied fruits and dried fruits. These cakes were basically works of art, but they took a ton of time skill and access to expensive ingredients. It really highlights the difference in baking cultures on each side of the Atlantic.
Like a tale of two cakes, Europe focused on artistry and tradition, while America was all about practicality and coming up with new solutions.
Mhm.
So what kinds of cakes were popular in each place?
Well, in Europe, those fancy fruit-filled cakes were a big hit. They were usually enjoyed during special occasions, and they actually evolved from boiled puddings.
Oh, that's interesting.
Basically, these puddings slowly started using more flour, and instead of cooking on the stovetop, they moved to the oven. That's how we got the ancestor of the fruitcake.
Ah, so that's the story behind those dense, fruity cakes. So what was going on in America?
In America, one of the favorites was pound cake, but it was a bit different from what we're used to today. Instead of vanilla, they used things like sweet wine caraway seeds and lemon.
A pound cake without vanilla. Can you imagine?
It's pretty wild, right? It
Yeah,
really makes you think about how our tastes have shifted over time.
it really does. But did Americans only stick to those European styles, or did they come up with their own creations?
Oh, they definitely forged their own path. One great example is king cake, a yeast risen cake that's a huge part of Mardi Gras celebrations in New Orleans.
Oh, yeah.
It's like a festive twist on an old world tradition. And then there were Indian cakes, these everyday cakes made with cornmeal, pumpkin, and molasses. It shows how indigenous cuisine influenced American baking.
It's amazing how they adapted recipes based on what ingredients they had around and their need for speed in the kitchen.
Absolutely. It was all about making do.
So we have pearlash making its mark, but did it stay the top leavening agent? Or did the search for something even better continue?
That's a great question. And that's exactly what we'll be digging into next. The story of pearlash is just the beginning. American innovation didn't stop there. The hunt for even better leavening agents led to some major breakthroughs that paved the way for the baking powder and those quick cakes we all know and love today. So stay tuned as we uncover the next chapter in the history of cake. So as we continue exploring how cakes evolved, it's super important to remember that the quest for lighter, fluffier cakes didn't just end with pearlash.
That's right. We talked about how American bakers embraced this pearlash as a leavening agent, but it wasn't perfect, right? That bitter, soapy taste must have been a challenge.
It was. So picture this. It's the 19th century, a time of amazing scientific discoveries.
Oh, yeah.
Chemists are unlocking the secrets of all these elements and compounds, and this knowledge really impacted so many areas of life, including the world of food and baking.
It's fascinating how things that seem so different, like chemistry and baking, can actually come together and influence each other.
Exactly. And as chemists learned more about the reactions behind how things rise, they started trying out different ingredient combinations, aiming to create a rising agent that tasted better and was more reliable. Think of it like culinary alchemy.
So they were trying to find a way to get that leavening effect of pearlash, but without the bad taste. Did it work?
It did. They figured out that by combining sodium bicarbonate, what we know as baking soda today, with an acid, something like cream of tartar, they could get a much cleaner, less bitter taste.
The birth of baking powder.
That's it.
It seems so obvious now, that blend of baking soda and an acid to activate it. Did this discovery make a big impact?
It was a game changer. Cakes could now be lighter, fluffier, and have more delicate flavors. It opened up a whole world of possibilities in baking and led to the quick cakes we love today.
Wow, from those multi-day yeast-risen cakes to the quick and easy ones we enjoy now. It's incredible how much baking has changed in such a short time.
It really is. And it's amazing to think about the impact this had on everyday life, especially for women who were often the main bakers in the home. These new leavening agents made things so much easier.
I bet. It freed up so much time and energy.
Exactly. And that meant they had more time for other things or even to try out new recipes.
It's amazing how something as simple as a leavening agent could have such a big ripple effect on society, changing not just our cakes, but the way we live our lives, too.
Absolutely.
Speaking of those early American cakes, we talked about king cake and Indian cakes, but were there any other unique types that stood out in your research?
Oh, there were some real treasures in those old cookbooks.
Right.
One that comes to mind is plum cake, which, as we talked about earlier, evolved from that traditional boiled pudding.
Plum cake. That sounds delicious. Was it similar to the fruit cakes we have today?
They were related for sure, but maybe a little less dense and not as boozy as our modern fruit cake. Plum cakes were usually a special occasion treat and were known for their rich flavors and moist texture.
And we can't forget about that pound cake. I'm still amazed that they used things like sweet wine, caraway seeds, and lemon instead of vanilla in those early American pound cakes.
It's a really cool look into how tastes have evolved, right? It makes you wonder what those early bakers would think of our modern cakes. Can you imagine their reaction to a fluffy vanilla cake with buttercream frosting?
I can only imagine. It just shows you how much our food culture is always changing, shaped by so many things, from scientific discoveries to global trade and cultural exchanges. Speaking of ingredients, it's interesting that vanilla wasn't a common thing in those early American cakes. Why is that?
Well, back in the early 19th century, vanilla was still pretty new and expensive. It was mainly something that professional bakers in Europe could get their hands on. It wasn't until later that vanilla became more accessible and eventually a staple in home baking.
Wow, so the ingredients people had access to really did influence those culinary traditions. It's hard to imagine a world without vanilla cake now.
I know, right? But it goes to show that our food culture is always evolving, shaped by so many factors. From the tough times of early American baking to the rise of chemical leavening and all the different cake styles, it's been quite a journey.
We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From how resourceful those early American bakers were to the scientific breakthroughs that changed the way we bake. It's clear that the world of cake has come a long way.
It certainly has.
But even with all the modern conveniences we have today, there's still something special about those early American cakes. You know, that rustic charm and the ingenuity behind them. I find that really appealing.
It's true. There's something about those early American cakes that makes you feel connected to the past. Like they were making more than just a cake, they were creating a piece of history.
Yeah, each cake was a testament to their skills and their patience and how they could adapt. It's so different from how we bake now, where everything is so quick and easy.
Speaking of those early American cakes, there's one we haven't mentioned yet that our research called the most distinctive early American cake. Any ideas? Well, thinking about how we talked about pear lash and how I had that off taste, I'm going to go with gingerbread.
Yeah, gingerbread definitely has a special place in the history of American cakes. Why do you think that is?
Well, gingerbread, with its strong, bold flavors, was the perfect way to hide that bitter, soapy taste from the pear lash. It's a great example of how those early bakers took a problem and turned it into something delicious.
It's a fascinating blend of necessity and flavor. They weren't just making something tasty, they were making the best of what they had.
Exactly, and gingerbread was more than just a cake. It was a symbol of warmth and hospitality and celebration. It was often enjoyed during holidays and special occasions, bringing people together with its amazing smell.
I can practically smell it now. It's interesting how gingerbread itself changed over time, from a thin, crispy cookie to a soft, moist cake.
That evolution really shows how creative and adaptable those early American bakers were. They weren't afraid to try new things and change recipes and make them their own.
So from those two-day yeast-risen cakes to the easy mixes we have today, the world of cake has come a long way. This deep dive has taken us on a journey of innovation, resourcefulness, and a love for creating delicious things.
And it shows us that food is more than just something to eat. It reflects our history, our culture, and our creativity.
Next time you bake a cake, whether it's from scratch or a box, take a moment to think about those early American bakers who made it all possible. What would they think of the cakes we enjoy today?
They were true pioneers in the kitchen, and their legacy lives on in every piece of cake we eat.
So which early American cake sounds the most interesting to you? The hearty Indian cake, the elegant plum cake, or the spicy, comforting gingerbread? Let us know on social media, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into captivating historical topics. Until next time, happy baking.